All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready. What are we diving into today?
Well, today it's all about marriage.
Ah, marriage.
But, and here's the twist, we're looking at it through the lens of millennials.
Interesting. I know there's a lot of talk about how millennials view marriage differently than previous generations.
Exactly. And to kick things off, we're going to be focusing on one specific person's take, someone named Javon Koo.
Okay, so we're going deep on just one person's perspective.
Yep. Now, of course, this is just one individual's view.
Right, not meant to represent all millennials.
Exactly. But Javon Koo's perspective is pretty thought-provoking. And it'll give us a good starting point to, jump into some bigger conversations about how marriage is evolving.
Sounds intriguing. So what does Javon Koo have to say about marriage?
All right, so this is a direct quote from Javon Koo.
Uh,
As a member of the millennial generation, I have reevaluated the concept of traditional marriage and no longer view it as a necessary institution. I perceive marriage primarily as a business arrangement that often favors one party over the other.
wow. That's pretty blunt.
Right. No sugarcoating there.
Yeah, it definitely challenges the traditional romantic view of
Big
marriage.
time. So what do you think as a sociologist about this idea of marriage as a business arrangement?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it suggests a more practical, maybe even transactional approach to marriage. It's less about love and romance and more about the legal and financial implications of partnership.
Like a contract almost.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what are the factors driving this shift? Is it economic uncertainty,
Hmm.
changing social norms, maybe a desire for more individual autonomy?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to unpack there. And Jivan Koo continues, saying, should I choose to marry, it would likely be to honor the desire for a celebratory experience, possibly through a spiritual ceremony held outside the United States to minimize governmental involvement.
Interesting.
What do you make of that?
Well, I see a couple of things there. First, the emphasis on the celebratory experience aligns with what we've been seeing in the wedding industry, right? It's all about creating these elaborate Instagrammable events.
Oh yeah, destination weddings, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. So maybe for some millennials, marriage is less about the lifelong commitment and more about the event itself.
That makes sense.
And then there's the part about minimizing government involvement, which could reflect a desire for more control over the terms of the marriage, defining it on their own terms.
So they're not necessarily rejecting the idea of marriage altogether, but they want to do it on their own terms.
Right. It's about reclaiming the meaning of marriage. And then Javon Koo adds, in such an arrangement, both parties would have the freedom to leave the relationship if they are ever unhappy. And I would take responsibility for any children we may have, ensuring their well-being regardless of the relationship status.
Okay, so there's this emphasis on individual happiness,
Yeah, even within the context of marriage.
but also a commitment to responsibility, especially when it comes to children.
Absolutely. It's like they're saying, look, I'm committed to being a good parent, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm bound to a particular relationship forever.
Right, so it's a different way of thinking about commitment. It's not just about staying together no matter what, but it's about finding a way to be responsible and caring, even if the relationship changes.
Exactly. And this ties into some of the work sociologists have been doing on liquid love, this idea that relationships are becoming more fluid and less permanent in modern society. So it's not necessarily that millennials are less committed, but rather that they're redefining what commitment looks like.
It's a fascinating concept. Okay, so we've got this idea of marriage as a business arrangement, the emphasis on personal happiness, the commitment to responsible parenting.
Right. And it gets even more interesting when you consider the next part of what Javon Koo says. It would be essential for both parties to clearly define their roles and responsibilities before proceeding with any wedding arrangements to avoid surprises. My approach is characterized by long-term thinking and loyalty, but ultimately, I respect that each individual must prioritize what is best for themselves.
There's a lot going on in that statement.
For sure.
What jumps out to me is this emphasis on communication and clarity.
Mhm.
Like, let's be upfront about expectations and responsibility.
Absolutely. Which makes sense, especially if you're viewing marriage as a partnership with potential legal and financial implications. You want to protect yourself, make sure everyone's on the same page.
But then Javon Koo also mentions long-term thinking and loyalty, which seems a bit, contradictory to the idea of leaving the relationship if you're unhappy.
Right. Like, how do those two things coexist? I think that's the key question here. Maybe for Javon Koo, Loyalty doesn't necessarily mean staying in the relationship no matter what, but rather supporting each other's growth and well-being, even if that means going separate ways.
So it's like a more nuanced understanding of what those terms mean.
Right. And long-term thinking might involve creating a framework for the relationship that allows for change and evolution over time.
Okay, so it's not about throwing out the old rule book entirely, but about adapting it to fit the realities of modern life and relationships.
Exactly. And it's important to remember this is just one person's perspective.
Right. We can't generalize to an entire generation based on one person's views.
But it definitely gives us some food for thought.
Huge thanks to Javon Koo for being so open and sharing their thoughts.
Yeah, it was really insightful.
And I think it leaves all of us with a lot to consider.
Absolutely. How is this evolving view of marriage going to shape our families, our communities, and our society? It's a conversation that's just getting started.
For sure. And one that we'll definitely be revisiting.